speaker is Dr. Valerie Pilmaier from the English department here. Val got her bachelor's from Oshkosh, right? UW Oshkosh, and PhD from Marquette, and is going to be talking about feminism and what George Bernard Shaw knew that we are just learning. So, Val, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. So the pointer thing isn't working because we don't have batteries for it, so I'm going to have to go back and forth. I hope you all are okay with that. I'm also going to read a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit as well. So I'm assuming most of you have heard of My Fair Lady. Was that Siri? Ask Siri, who's George Bernard Shaw? It can be interactive, that's okay. So most of you have heard of the movie My Fair Lady, or you have heard of the Broadway show of My Fair Lady. That comes from a George Bernard Shaw play called Pygmalion. And the screenplay for the 1938 version of Pygmalion was actually written by George Bernard Shaw, and he received an Academy Award for that. But we don't know Shaw very much anymore. But one of the things you need to know is that he was a staple. He was sort of a force, and he wrote over 60 plays. And he is considered sort of the second most important British playwright in all of British literature. So one of the things that I think is pretty fantastic about him is the way that he champions social issues, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I would say he's a genius. Was he a feminist? Well, I'll tell you that there's a lot of contention in terms of that. It depends on the way that you define the word feminist. It depends on the way that you look at the historical moment that he was living in. And there are tons of articles and tons of books that have deliberated about that, but that's not our objective tonight. We're doing something a little bit different tonight. Tonight I'm going to try to talk about why I feel that Shaw should be reintroduced into classrooms and why we need to look at the wisdom of his plays, because it really speaks to ideas of equality in terms of gender and opportunity that we're trying to get to today, which is 100 years after he was writing. Okay, so this is Shaw. He looks like everybody's old uncle. He was born in Dublin to a lower middle class family. It's really important to understand his history, actually, because it helps you understand why he was writing about the things he was writing about. His father was a civil servant that was put into that position sort of because of relatives and friends pushed him to it. He wasn't very bright. He wasn't very good. He actually sort of was a big alcoholic. He was unsuccessful as a civil servant, and then he later became a corn merchant, and he was unsuccessful at that as well. He was married to Lucinda Elizabeth Shaw, and she was not happy with him. It was a marriage of convenience for her. It was a marriage of love for him, and she ended up actually running off to London with her singing master, whose stage name was Vandeleur Lee, which sounds fabulous. And she had her two daughters go with her. Bernard stayed with his dad, and he couldn't handle being with his father anymore because his father was a horrible man. And then he went to London, and he became self-educated. He spent hours and hours and hours in the British Library every day trying to fill in the education that he did not have from when he was growing up. And he ended up becoming one of the most important music and theater critics in British society at the time, which is a pretty remarkable thing. He heard about the Fabian Society, which was started by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, and they were all about progressive social causes. He happened to read the very first treatise that they wrote, and he said, you know what, I could write something for you. So he ended up writing the second treatise, and then he sort of was one of the founding members of the Fabian Society. The Fabians believed that in order to make society better, you had to introduce changes gradually. So you wouldn't want wholesale suffrage, for example, because people wouldn't be able to accept the enormity of how that would rock society, you'd have to do it a little bit at a time, piecemeal. And so one of the things that he was really interested in doing was introducing notions of equality into plays so that people could kind of think about it, deliberate over it, and then legalize it. And so that was one of the platforms that he used when he was writing. He began writing plays in 1892 because one of his friends saw one of his theater critiques that he did and said, "You could do better stuff than this." He's like, "You think so?" "Yeah, I think you could." And he was right. So it's a good thing that his friend pushed him into it. He did get married when he was around 41 to Charlotte Payne Townsend. It was not a romantic marriage. She was very, very wealthy and enabled him to do what he wanted, which was to write for the rest of his life. And they did stay married until 1943. He won the Nobel Prize in 1925. And as I said, he won an Academy Award, and he lived to be 94 years old. He was out on a ladder fixing a window, and he fell off, and then he died 2 days later. So that's Shaw. So some of the more famous plays that he wrote, if you take a look, you'll see they all revolve around the idea of social progress. So his first play, Widower's Houses, was about slums and slumlords and why those are bad things, which is really ridiculous thinking about that today. Well, of course slums and slumlords are horrible things, but at the time it was kind of just expected that most people lived in tenements, that most people lived in substandard housing, and that if you were lucky enough to be wealthy enough to live outside of that, that means that you were kind of in God's good graces, and you should just accept your lot in life. And he took issue with that. Some of the other plays, Mrs. Warren's Profession, you'll see this around repertory a lot. This is about a prostitute who ends up making a better life for her daughter, who has no idea that her mother is a prostitute, and there's an interesting conversation that ensues after the daughter finds out. It's fabulous. You should check it out. Arms and the Man is it's a treatise against war. And some of the other ones you'll see. But they all sort of revolve around this notion of social class, equity issues for women. So if you think about it, his mother had a very unhappy marriage. It was something that he lived, right? And it really influenced him to see how we have women in society who are the heart of the family, the heart of society, and they have no rights, right? They have no rights at all, and he thought that that was a travesty. So that brings us to what I am going to be talking about, this play, You Never Can Tell, which was published in Plays Pleasant in 1898. It was Plays Pleasant and Plays Unpleasant. This one is a Plays Pleasant because it ends happily. And it has kind of a ridiculous premise. So how many of you are familiar with Oscar Wilde, the playwright Oscar Wilde? The Importance of Being Earnest. Can somebody give me a quick summary of that play? Anyone, anyone, anyone? Joe, you can, right?
Yeah, but, okay, so...
He's like, I'm on, all right.
In short, it's very simple and very complicated at the same time. It involves a lost baby left at a carriage railway, and it involves a young woman who says that she always brings her diary along to read on the train because she always needs something sensational while she's traveling. And that doesn't sound funny when said out loud just that way, but in the course of the play, it's hilarious. And it's very, it seems to be about nothing.
Yeah.
As much as a Seinfeld episode, you could say it's about nothing except for this lost baby plot.
So, okay, I'm sorry, I totally put you on the spot there. So the importance of being earnest is predicated on this idea of ridiculous circumstance. So these people happen to come together in this sort of ridiculous way. They're all kind of interrelated. There's a sense of identity that's established. Somebody's father is recognized. A whole new identity is created. And that's exactly sort of what happens in this play, You Never Can Tell. So it starts out with this family of 4. There's a woman, and she has 3 children. They've been living in Madeira for the past 18 years. We find out that she had a really unhappy marriage that she escaped. The youngest daughter, Dolly, has to have her tooth taken out. She goes to a dentist named Valentine. Of course, his name is Valentine. And it just so happens that Valentine's landlord is their father that they've never met before, right? Stupid. Sounds ridiculous, right? No. Well, okay, maybe. But it all works out because it's supposed to be showcasing issues of social inequity for women at the time. So it was just sort of a nod to Oscar Wilde a little bit. Yeah, so people don't really write about this play very much. They kind of consider it to be, well, they don't know what to consider it. So some people think it's sort of this little light comedy. Some people say it's a drawing room comedy. Some people say it's a Bakhtinian rereading of this or that. There's a lot of different ways that people have looked at it, but nobody has really looked at it as being anything that's particularly important. And I tend to think that that's a problem. And the reason I think that that's a problem is because I think one of the things that this play can do is help people understand the different waves of feminism, because it's a perfect breakdown of how feminism has played out in both the United States and the United Kingdom since about the 1850s. So that brings us to, well, what is feminism, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding about the term. There's a lot of fear about the term feminist. I can tell you, even today I have students that will say, well, I'm not a feminist, but I don't want to say I'm into feminism. And I think, well, okay, well, what does that mean? So when we think about the word feminist, if somebody could read that definition, I would really appreciate it. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Yeah, go ahead.
Of relating to or advocating the rights and equality of women.
Yeah. So the issue, I think, is the fear that it's just about women, right? And that's where there's kind of a misunderstanding. So if you then take a look at feminism, could you read that definition for us?
Advocacy of equality of the sexes and the advancement of political, social, and economic rights of the female sex. The movement associated with this.
So the definition here is a bit different, isn't it? Because this is suggesting the equality of the sexes, whereas the other one is just sort of focused on women. And that's where the big contention in terms of that term feminist comes from. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So if we look at what the word means and what it's supposed to do, we'll see that it's really just about making sure that women have the same rights as men in society. Not more than, not less than, just the same, right? So now we're going to talk about the waves of feminism in the U.S. This is Mary Wollstonecraft. And feminists kind of look to her as our literary mother. In 1792, she wrote A Vindication on the Rights of Woman. And she was advocating that women have the same rights as men in society. They should be looked on as the same, that we're all human beings. Didn't get much traction. There were some people that were like, yeah! But a lot of people were not very comfortable with that. In the 1850s, this notion of the women question was something that started coming up, this idea of what should women's rights be, where should the line be drawn, should they have suffrage, should they have education, should they have Legal rights, should they be able to own property? Should they be able to have divorce rights? All of those things started to be discussed. And then it sort of started coming to a head in the 1890s, and Sarah Grand came up with a phrase, the new woman, to describe women who were independent, and they loved being independent. That didn't necessarily mean that they didn't need men, but what it meant was that they were not willing to settle for marriages that were loveless, just as economic transactions. That they wanted to be an equal partner in a marriage, that they had something to contribute, and it was important to recognize that. The Married Women's Property Act of 1848 in the United States started giving women the rights to property. So there were some states that started giving women property rights as early as 1809. And then there were states that waited until much later to give women property rights, but most of them started giving women property rights in 1848. There were very restrictive divorce laws until the 1960s in this country, as well as in the United Kingdom. Does anybody know anything about the divorce laws, what you would have to do in order to be able to get a divorce until the no-fault divorces of the 1960s? Very strange and very repressive. So if two people were in a marriage and they wanted to get divorced, that wasn't okay because they weren't trying hard enough. And if two people were in a marriage and one of them was having an affair and the other one knew it and was okay with it, you couldn't get a divorce for that. Like, there were always these very strange repressive divorce laws. So there were very strict, restrictive ways that people could get divorces. Because women were not allowed to have jobs for the most part, particularly middle class and upper class women, if they would decide that they would get a divorce, they would be left with nothing if they had no right to property. So it really was an economic equity issue for women. The right to education was something that most women couldn't have guaranteed to them. There was the Moral Land Grant Colleges Act of 1862 in the United States that gave women the right to go to the university. This didn't happen until 1877 in the UK. But if you take a look how long it takes to get to the vote. 1918 in the UK, 1920 in the United States. So when we think about waves of feminism, this is considered the first wave. From the moment that Mary Wollstonecraft had a Vindication on the Rights of Woman published until suffrage was gained in the United States is the first wave, because the whole thing was trying to get women just on an equal level playing field in terms of legal rights with men. That still left a lot to be desired. And these are some pictures of the new woman. So while a lot of women that were coming up in the 1890s, the 1900s, were out there and trying to get suffrage and looking for their rights, there was a huge fear of these women, right? So if you take a look, she is in bloomers and she's smoking. The man's like lost his legs. The babies are freaking out, flying around in a cradle, and the work's not getting done at home, right? Because she's out hanging out smoking on the street corner. This one, she's so wrapped up in all of this knowledge that she's ignoring everything else. And this one, I don't know what's going on with him. He's having some kind of conniption fit. But look at what we have, the home or the street corner for women. Vote no to women's suffrage. So it's this idea that you can't have everything. You can only have one or the other. If you give women rights, then they're going to turn into men. What good is that, right? Because then you can't have more kids because there's just a bunch of men, and that's no fun, right? But it's clearly a faulty dichotomy. So that brings us to You Never Can Tell. And the whole idea is predicated on looking at a problematic marriage, a marriage that might be taking place, and two people that don't care at all about marriage. So the first two people, Mrs. Clandon, who was Mrs. Crampton, and her husband, are an example of the problems with the patriarchy. So she is considered to be a new woman because she left her husband when, in 1870, she could divorce him and have the rights to her property. And at the same time, she'd have the rights to her children, which didn't happen before 1870. So as soon as she could divorce her husband, she left because she could not deal with a relationship where she was treated sort of as a prisoner. Everything she did was taken into account with her husband. She always had to kowtow to him with everything that she did, and she just didn't feel any sense of freedom. And she didn't want to live like that, right? So the thing that we need to think about with this character, in 1898, when this play came out, nobody had seen anything like this. It's completely revolutionary. So you're telling me that an upper-class woman is going to leave her wealthy husband, take her kids, move to a different country, and start out on her own, become an author, and she's super successful? Because that's what he's suggesting. There is nothing bad that happens to her. Only good things come of this. It's an ultimate positive for her to leave him. And the suggestion that women could leave their husbands and that it's okay hadn't really happened before. So Ibsen, in A Dollhouse, had a character who left her husband, but we don't know what happens because it's like curtain fall when she leaves. And that caused an uproar. Oh my God, oh my God. Shaw was very influenced by Ibsen and the ideas that he proposed in his dramas. But he wanted to show, you know what? If women leave repressive marriages where they're treated like servants, what can happen? Well, only good things, right? So if you think about the seismic shift that would cause into British society, with women who are in these loveless marriages because they feel they have no way out. Huge. It's huge, right? Her husband is horrible. Like, he's horrible. If you take a look at this, he is the representation of the patriarchy. He is all of those stultifying ideas of men cramping down on women and having to have respect and duty and all of that other stuff. But I will tell you, one of the things that's very interesting about this play is that Shaw refuses to paint him as simply a villain. He makes it a point to say that having gotten married to a woman who didn't love him was worse than having no wife at all. And that nobody thinks about what it was like for him to get married to somebody who he thought loved him, and then it turns out that she didn't love him at all, that she just wanted his money, right? So one of the things I think that's brilliant about Shaw is he's never willing to just have one-sided characters, one-sided relationships. He's always trying to show you a multiplicity of problems that arise from these things that we take for granted, that maybe we shouldn't be taking for granted. One of the amazing things that happens throughout the course of this play is that he changes completely. He admits that he was wrong, he admits that he was repressive, he admits that he wasn't a good father, and at the end, he ends up being the father that everybody wants him to be. Does not mean that he gets back together with his wife. They do not get back together. And in fact, she kind of wants nothing to do with him. But he still can change as a person, and that's because of seeing how happy the rest of the family is without having him to bring them down, which is pretty remarkable too. Okay, so that was our first wave, but this play speaks to the other waves of feminism as well. So if we think about the second wave of feminism, this revolves around liberation issues. And I think there's some people in the room that can speak to some of the issues that were brought forward in the second wave of feminism. So while the first wave of feminism was really concerned with getting the vote, looking at education rights, making sure that women could divorce, at least had the option of doing that. The second wave was really predicated off of the freedoms that women enjoyed because of being able to work during World War II. So what happened during World War II with women and working? And why is that such a good thing? And what did it show women? Yeah, right? So women won that war in a lot of ways, right? Because they were making all the artillery. They were making all of the mess kits. They were making the things that the men had been making before. And they were doing it just as well. And they were doing a damn good job. And they also liked it. They liked being able to be proud of the labor that they were producing, being part of the war effort, making their labor known. Now, that doesn't mean that labor at home is not significant. That isn't what we're suggesting. But what we're suggesting is that the idea that women could be just as important in the workforce was pretty revolutionary at the time, right? Because we had never seen anything like it before. Now, keep in mind, lower class women had always worked, always. So this, if we're thinking about it, this is a middle class and upper class concern. And that's something that's going to come into the discussion for the third wave of feminism, because it seems to get ignored when we start thinking about this. So some of the things that happened were the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States, where there was equal job opportunity for women. There's no sex discrimination allowed in occupations anymore. The idea of equal pay for equal work was broached. Have we reached that? That's not a concern anymore, right? Okay. Oh yeah, and then look, reproductive rights, health issues, sexuality rights. We're totally on top of this today, right? I didn't say that. Note, I didn't say that. Okay, so some of the things that happened at this period of time was the notion of no-fault divorces. Then a woman could say, I just want to get a divorce because it's not working, right? And the guy could say, yeah, this isn't working for me. It's okay. Women were able to have credit cards in their own names, which they weren't able to have prior to this time. They had to have their husband's credit card, and they had to ask him for his permission if it was okay if they used the credit card. They started to be able to sit on juries and have custody. Abortion was legalized in the UK in 1967, in the United States in 1973. It's been contentious in this country ever since. It has not been in the UK, which is interesting. Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 in the UK and Employment Protection Act of 1975 in the UK, and then the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1982. So the thing you need to know about the Equal Rights Amendment, it was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1923 and introduced into legislation that year. It was introduced every subsequent year until it was brought to be ratified in 1982, and they lost by 2 states. 2 states wouldn't ratify it, and that's why we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. It has been brought into legislation every year since, but there has not been enough support in Congress to bring it again to be ratified, which is, I think, really sad and problematic. So, when we think about the word feminist, how many of you think feminazi? Heard it before. What does it mean? That you're a man hater, you're going to cut off some genitals, you're burning bras, you hate everything having to do with men, and you want a woman's commune away from men, and yeah, okay, right, this is the contention about it. Where does that come from? Okay, so it comes from an incorrect understanding of the word feminist, right? And it comes from this fear or belief that the second wave of feminism was proposing that women were more important than men in society, that their rights were more important than men's rights, that their position in society should supersede men, and that their whole idea was now to kind of squash men the way men had squashed them before. It's not true, right? It's never been true. The thing that we need to think about is the power of words and how words can change public sentiment, right? So if you say to a group full of people, do you think that a woman and man should be the same for the same job that they do? The pay should be equal. Well, yeah. Do you think that women should have the right to a job? Well, yeah. Do you think women should have the right to a college degree? Well, of course. Do you realize you're a feminist? No, 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 no. And it's all because the definition has been perverted in our society, right? And I do think that that has to do with fear, and that has to do with an incorrect notion of what people were working for at this moment in history. So how does this relate to You Never Can Tell? We have a character whose name is Gloria, and she is the oldest daughter of the Cramptons. And she has been raised to believe in reason and logic. She is not sentimental. She is not emotional. She has been taught that you should take people at their word and respect them at their word. So she is not prepared to meet somebody who's going to hoodwink her. And what happens is she meets Valentine, and he's like the hookup king. And he sees in her, oh, she's one of those new women who's all about reason and logic. I bet I can get her in like 20 minutes. I bet I can have her crawling on the floor in 20 minutes. And that's what he decides that he's going to do. And the interesting thing is, he's very forthright in telling Gloria's mother that that's what his aim is. But Gloria doesn't know this, and she ends up falling in love with him. And then she figures it out. And then she says, I don't care, because I know what you are, and I know what I am, and I like you anyway, and I think we can make it work out. And he's like, really? And she says, I think so. But guess what? I'm the one with the money, and I'm the one with the power, and I'm the one that makes the decisions, and you're the one that's going to say yes. And he says, sounds good to me. That's fabulous. I'll do that. So when we look at this group of characters, it's contentious. You can tell it's not a perfect love match. There's a lot of gender issues that they're trying to deal with. There's a lot of things that are out of balance that they're trying to deal with. But that's okay, right? Because they're going to make it work, which is really interesting. And this was one of the first times where we saw a man willing to give up his seat of power to a woman who just very blatantly says, I'm the one that's going to have the power in the relationship. And he says, sure, happy days, right? Now, is this what I am suggesting the second wave of feminism is all about? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I will say this. Because of the rights that women fought for and won in the second wave of feminism, it caused a huge upheaval in American and British society, right? So the things that people had taken for granted for a very long time, they could not take for granted any longer. All of a sudden, you have women that are in the workforce in droves in ways that they hadn't been before. Even in the 1960s, 1950s, we had more homemaker wives than we had wives in the workplace. Starting in the 1970s, that number was changing until we get to today, where we have more women in the workplace for the most part than staying at home, which is a seismic shift in terms of society. What does that do to masculinity? If you have these notions of what is feminine and what is masculine, and women start taking on more of the stereotypical masculine roles in society, it's going to cause a sense of anxiety, right? It's going to cause people to rethink what they knew before. And so one of the things that happens out of this is like a hyper sense of masculinity that arises in both American and British culture to kind of contain that female assumption of power. So this was what I was talking about with Valentine when he's kind of laying it out on the line that he knows that he's just playing her. But the thing that happens is he ends up really respecting her and really liking her as a person because she's honest. She's not duplicitous. And he decides that in the end it's better for him to be with somebody that he can respect than somebody that he can just hoodwink all of the time. It's better that she knows who he is and that she knows who he is at a root level so that they can start out fresh and work through the problems, which is what we're getting to, right? I think one of the things that's incredible about what's happening in American society is that men and women are starting to see each other as equals instead of as one holding more power than the other. At least I'd like to think that. Which brings us to the third and fourth waves of feminism. Okay. It's third/fourth wave because there's a lot of contention in terms of gender studies about what wave we're currently in. The notion of the wave is important because it signifies that you move forward and you move backward, and that each one kind of works with the other one, and it's not rigid definitions, but they all kind of blend together and move forward and backward. The key with this most recent iteration of feminism is it's much more inclusive than any other waves of feminism have been before. So now it's really important for people to recognize intersectionality. What is intersectionality? Does anybody know what it is? Can you explain it? So intersectionality is the idea that every single person has areas of privilege and every single person has areas of discrimination. You might be a woman, but you might be wealthy. You might be gay, and you might be a white man. All of those have indices of discrimination and privilege, and that we cannot lump all people into one category because that's not thinking about their individual experience, because individual experience is really important to acknowledge. So the idea that we're now working towards in terms of feminism is not necessarily that one gender should have more than the other, but that all genders should have equality. That if a woman wants to be president of the United States, that's okay, right? And if a man wants to be a kindergarten teacher, that doesn't make him weird or creepy. That means that he wants to be around kids, right? So what's happening in our society is that, at least in some areas, we're striving to create a situation where all genders have the same opportunity and that one is not kept out of certain areas simply because of gender, right? Which brings us to Dolly and Phil. They are the twins, and they're really interesting characters. Some people hate them, some people love them, but they are fraternal twins, and so they're sort of androgynous complements to each other. They create one perfect whole. Dolly and Phil don't care about romance. They don't care about sex. They co-opt conversations all the time. They jump in. They make fun of people. They will come and say, well, what do you mean? I don't know what you mean. Just tell me the truth. They're always seeking truth. That's what their whole job is. They are the characters in the play that call out all of the inconsistencies. They are the ones that recognize that Valentine is in love with Gloria. They're the ones that recognize that that marriage is probably doomed to failure because they're both really flawed characters. Dolly smokes and drinks, and she doesn't care. She comes out on stage smoking, and her father's like, "Oh," and she's like, "Whatevs. This is my life. I'm going to do whatever I want." Phil has no interest in having a father. He thinks, I can be my own father. I don't need you. So these characters are revolutionary in a lot of different ways, and they're the most important characters in the play because they further all of the most important plot elements. You cannot have this play without these characters, which I think is really fascinating because most people think that they're just kind of inconsequential and they brush them off, but they're really important. Now, I want you to take a look at this scene. This is scene 2 of Act 1.
The fact is, Mr. Valentine, we are the children of Mrs. Lanfrey Clandon, an authoress of great repute in Madeira. No household is complete without her works. We came to England to get away from them. They're called the 20th century treatises.
20th century cooking.
20th century creeds.
20th century clothing.
20th century conduct.
20th century children.
20th century parents.
Cloth lamp, $1/2.
All mounted on linen for hard family use, $2. No household should be without them. You should read them, Mr. Valentine. They'll improve your mind.
But not till we've gone, please.
Oh, quite so. Our own minds are in that fresh and unspoiled condition.
Phil, he prefers people whose minds are improved.
In that case, we must introduce him to the other member of the family. The woman of the 20th century, our sister Gloria.
Nature's masterpiece.
Learning's doctor.
Madeira's pride.
Beauty's paragon.
Posh. No complexion.
May I have a word?
Oh, excuse us, go ahead.
So sorry.
I really must give a hint to you young people.
Oh, come. I like that. How old are you?
Over 30.
He's not.
He is.
27.
33.
Stuff.
I appeal to you, Mr. Valentine.
Well, really, it's 31.
You were wrong.
So are you.
Oh, we're forgetting our manners, Dolly.
Yes, so we are.
We interrupted you, Mr. Valentine.
You're going to improve our minds, I think.
The fact is, you're...
Oh, here.
Our manners.
Oh, do let me speak.
The old story we talked.
Okay, so if you see their characters, the way that their characters are, they are not British in the sense of what we think of as British, right? They're not very polite, they're rude, they jump in, they talk over, they don't care. They don't care. And the thing that I think is really important about them is that they cut through the bull. They cut through all the subterfuge. They get right to the point. So when they were talking about their mother, they talked about how much the volumes cost. You're not supposed to talk about money, are you? You're never supposed to talk about money. But they know he's interested in how much money the mother has, and she is very prolific in her writing. She's very, very popular, and so they're just putting it out on the table. They say that their sister is like the pride of Madeira and that she's really beautiful and she's really wonderful. Are they jealous of that? No, they don't care. They're not interested. They absolutely don't care. So the thing that you need to recognize about Dolly and Phil is they're a closed system. They're not interested in anybody else, but they're going to call out any sort of obnoxiousness or deceit or subterfuge because they don't understand the point. What's the point, right? Because in terms of Shaw's world, they've evolved to the point where you don't need that anymore, right? If you're just honest with every person that you deal with, you don't have to fake them out. Who cares? You're not going to impress me. You're going to make me feel sorry for you if you're going to lie to me, because I know what the truth is, right? So that's why they're sort of the highest level in terms of Shaw. Now, there are some complications with Dolly and Phil. They're brother and sister, which is gross, right? The issue with this version of perfect relationship is it's sexless. And that's the thing that comes up again and again and again and again with Shaw, because he really believed that once you started putting hormones into the equation, you go crazy, and there's no sense of reason, and you can't get it back. So he couldn't figure out how to come up with a relationship where people were having sex and not losing their mind. at the same time. I think there's something to be said for that. I think one of the things that is really important is he says that women have to unlearn the false good manners of slavery before they can acquire the genuine good manners of their freedom. And that's something that we're seeing today, right? So in order to take on freedom, you kind of have to get rid of all of the stuff that keeps you down. And that's a hard thing for society to deal with. Because when you're so used to people being put in a box and suddenly they get out of that box and they leave that box behind, it can be really difficult for the people that have to deal with the box that's left behind, right? So, what do we do? Well, I think we need to think about the wisdom of Shaw and his recognition that you can't have people like the first couple where it's always about power dynamics. You can't have people like the second couple who have this weird, who knows what's going on with them, and they're probably not going to last. But if everybody tries to strive towards equality and seeing each other as a human being and recognizing that there's something beautiful about that, that's the only way to move forward, right? So I don't know if any of you saw this. This was a Super Bowl commercial from Airbnb. I think Shaw would love this. And then there's the bikini lady in the feminism presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments or thoughts on any of this? Yeah.
I was struck some time ago the era that he lived, that he created. I'm looking at it as a drama, the roles that he wrote for women at a time when women were regarded. That, for me, was really exciting. For instance, we've made Eliza from the musical as a big focus, but in the play Pygmalion, his mother, Henry Higgins' mother, has a wonderful role, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, has a very important role. And it really hits you that he really did wonder, if you're an actress, they had wonderful opportunities to play, fit at a time when women in their daily lives were not all that important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was one of the things that was really important to him, to showcase women on the stage as well, because it's that same idea. If it's something that you see and it becomes normal to you to see it, it can become normal to perform it, right? And so it was really important to him to have females represented in powerful roles, not just as ancillary characters, not just as servants, but as people who really furthered the drama, furthered the action of the piece. Any other questions, comments, or? I think all of this is really important in this historical moment that we are living in right now, because I think it's one of the most important historical moments that we've seen, particularly in terms of rights for women, but not just for women, for LGBTQ and for people of color and race issues and all kinds of different issues. It's all kind of coming to the fore right now. And I think Shaw would love that. And I can imagine that he would be writing really interesting and provocative plays to speak to that. So my hope is that if you see a production of a Shaw play, you'll go, that you'll check it out. If you see something of Shaw on television, you'll watch it. You'll look at his biography, because he really had a lot to say that we can learn from him. Thank you.